Good afternoon, class. Today we are discussing about a very pertinent and important topic in the psychological research, which we know as variables. As you see, it is written on the board that we are discussing about today the different type of variables and what is variable, how the operationalization and conceptualization of variables comes from the concept, as well as the most important part of the variable is what are the different type of variables and what are the parameters based on which we are classifying or dividing the variables. So, before we get into the point of different types, let us discuss about first that what is variable. Firstly, we all know in psychology the most important autonomous body or governing body who provides the framework for any psychological disorder as well as different psychological approaches is known as the APA. APA stands for American Psychological Association, and APA is the most important governing framework in any psychological approaches. So, let us first discuss about how APA, American Psychological Association, defines variable. Sorry. So, at first the APA define variable as a condition in an experiment or characteristics or entity that can take on different categories or labels or values that can be measured. That means, here we are talking about three important things, that is first one is characteristics, second one is entity, and the third one is objects. So, when we are able to measure all these three things, when we able to measure all these three things either in terms of quantity or in terms of quality, it is a different thing. We are discuss about the quantity and quality later. It is called as the variable. So, it is a basic definition and it is the definition provided by the APA which we follow, as well as different researchers in the field of psychology or different researchers in the field of research methodology specifically provide a different comprehensive definition about the domain of variable. So, let us understand, we are discussing about the psychological variables. We are not considering the variables of other disciplines because they are completely different from our domain. So, we are talking about only the psychological variables. So, when we say that we let us understand the definition provided by the eminent researchers in the field of research methodology, we try to enumerate that we are considering only those persons, only those researchers who belongs to the psychological research methodology. Okay. So, one of the prominent figures in the psychological research is was Carlinger, who provide a very short but very important and comprehensive definition of variables. He said that variable is a property that take as different values. That means, anything or any property that we able to valued or provide a valuation is known as the variable. I am recommending a book of research methodology that is known as the research method in behavioral sciences. The author of the book is Dr. A.K. Singh, as well as I am referring another book which is very good book in the field of psychological research methodology. is given by Mohsin as well as the book of Carlinger. You will get the comprehensive and different definitions of variable from those books either, or you can refer Google, as all of you have the access of internet and smartphone right now. So, you can refer to the Google and you can get many definitions of psychological variable. There are a lot of definitions are there. You just need to understand what is the main concept or what is the main content they try to explore through the definition of variable. Okay. So, I am not getting into the definition part more and more. Now, I am considering how variables comes into the psychological research and how we can deduct from the concept to variable. So, first thing we need to understand, there is a thing which is known as concept. Variable is the ultimate or end result which started from the concept. Concept, what is concept? Concept is an abstract thing. Abstract thing related to a domain. So, when I am saying the abstract thing, that means we cannot measure it, we not able to measure that particular thing. That means the concept is completely a theoretical construct, and concept is very much a subjective phenomena. Subjective phenomena, that is why in case of concept individual difference always exist. Okay? Though the first thing which we are talking about is the concept. Concept is the abstract thing related to any domain. Suppose let us take an example, when we are talking about anxiety, one might say that when I am facing a adverse situation I became anxious. Someone might say that I am anticipating something and I became anxious. So, the anxiety is here, the anxiety is a concept that is very much theoretical. You are not able to measure the anxiety, and the definition of anxiety varies from one person to another. So, if we try to measure the anxiety through the form of concept, it is not possible. So, we need to go back and we need to deduct more and more to get into the concept of variable. So, after the concept, what we get is another thing. From the concept we further deduct into another domain which is known as the conceptualization. So, what conceptualization say? Conceptualization claims that when we convert the abstract thing into a concrete domain, convert the abstraction into concreteness or concrete domain. So, just get back to the example of anxiety, how we can get into the conceptualization. So, in concept we say that one might say anxiety is something, another might say no, anxiety is another thing. So, there is a difference of opinion. So, when we get into the conceptualization, what we do as a psychological researcher, as a researcher we convert that theoretical concept into a practical approach, and how what process we follow to change the concept into conceptualization. We follow a simple process, nothing but we just doing a extensive literature review, we are doing a extensive understanding of the previous researches happened and on that particular domain, and then we identify what is the proper definition of anxiety, what are the domains are involved in anxiety, what are the domains are part of anxiety. So, through that process of conceptualization, we able to convert the abstract knowledge of anxiety into a concrete knowledge, and through that we are able to further make it into a variable. So, that is the part of concept and conceptualization, and after the conceptualization what happened, we are focusing on another very important thing that is known as the operationalization. After conceptualization, what we do? We convert the conceptual knowledge into measurable facet. After the conceptualization, what we do? Now we try to convert the conceptual knowledge which we get from the conceptualization. So, what I say previously, in conceptualization we get into or we stand into a uniqueness where we say, okay, the definition of anxiety is that, and anxiety involves such domains. Suppose physical domain, psychological domain, cognitive domain, there are lot of domains in anxiety. Let's just consider two domains, physical and psychological. So, when we know that anxiety has only two domains, physical and psychological, then we able to convert that knowledge into a measurable facet, and that process of conversion is known as the operationalization. And when we operationalize that particular conceptual knowledge into a measurable facet, then that particular domain is known as the variable. So, that is the deduction process of variable. We start from the concept, after the concept we get into the conceptualization, and after the conceptualization we get into the third part, which is operationalization, and after the operationalization what we get? We get the thing which we discussed today, that is variable. So, that is the deduction process of variable through which we understand how variables comes into account. So, every variable has some properties and every variable must have some objects. Either the variable is an objective thing or the variable has some properties. So, after that theoretical consideration of variables, what are the variables are, what is the definition of variable, and how we deduct from variable from the concept to variable. Now, we shifting our focus into the most important part, and mostly in question of your Sem exam you will get a question that is briefly discuss about the different or discuss in detail the different types of variables, and mainly it is come as a 10 marks question. Okay. So, you need to understand the what is the different type of variable. Okay. Oh, before that, another thing, when we are talking about variable, it must possess two properties, that is exhaustion and another property is mutual exclusiveness or exclusivity. A variable is considered as variable when that particular domain consists of those two characteristics, because without those two characteristics we are not say any construct as a variable. What exhaustion or exhaustiveness tells about? It refers to the all possible outcomes. So, when we say a particular domain, suppose in case of anxiety, when we say anxiety is a variable, then the anxiety must have the exhaustiveness or exhaustion. That means when we try to measure anxiety, we know all the outcomes, or we know that if someone tells about the anxiety of or if someone measured the anxiety, then we have all the outcomes, and if we miss some of the outcomes, then the anxiety is not considered as a variable. First one is the exhaustion. And what is mutual exclusivity? That is uniqueness of the framework. It provides the uniqueness of the framework. That means if we measure anxiety, then we only measure anxiety. Another domain, suppose someone say you have a scale to measure the anxiety, but I am saying no, this is a scale which measure anxiety as well as I think it measures the depression also. If I say that, then the construct of anxiety has a lack of mutual exclusivity. That means when we measure a particular domain or when we measure a particular variable, it only measures that particular domain, not any other type of domain. Okay. So, when we say the anxiety is a variable, it must possess the property of mutual exclusivity. That means it only measures the anxiety if any of the factor or if any of the characteristics of anxiety is related with the depression, then it is not considered as the variable of anxiety because it does not possess the mutual exclusivity. Okay. So, that is the very important property of variable which provided by the Adelke in 2000. Adelke in 2000, and it is the most important property of variable, any variable. Okay. Now, we are discussing about what are the different type of variables. So, before we start on into the what are the different type of variables, firstly we understand what are the parameters are there based on which we divide or we classify the variables. The first parameter which we consider is known as the causal relationship. The second parameter is study design, and the third parameter is unit of measurement. So, those three are the parameters or bases based on which we further classify the variables. So, firstly, when we are saying the causal relationship, based on the causal relationship we can classify the variables into 4 different characteristics into 4 different types, sorry. The first is independent variable, second is dependent variable, third one is extraneous variable, I have not written variable again and again, and the last one is intervening or confounding variables. Okay. Based on the causal relationship, we can classify variables into 4 types, that is independent variable, dependent variable, extraneous variable and intervening variable. Based on the study design, we can classify the variable into 2 different categories. One is known as the active variable and another is known as the attribute variable. Okay. And last one is the most important parameter to understand the different type of variables, that is known as the unit of measurement. And on the basis of unit of measurement, firstly we classify unit of measurement into 2 categories, that is qualitative variables and the second one is known as the quantitative variables. Okay. Further, we can categorize quantitative variables into 2 different categories. The first one is known as the categorical or discrete quantitative variables, and the second one is known as the continuous quantitative variables. Okay. So, further quantitative variables is categorized into another 2 categories, that is first one is known as the categorical or discrete variables. In some books you find it as categorical, in some books you find it as discrete. So, more or less the same thing, and another is continuous variable. Further, we can classify the categorical variables into another 3 characteristics. The first one is known as the constants, second one is known as the dichotomous, and third one is known as the polytomous. Further, polytomous is also classified into 2 categories, one is nominal and other is ordinal, and we able to categorize the continuous variable into 2 parts. First one is interval variable and the next one is ratio variable. So, that is the classification chart of the concept variable, where we see the different parameters or bases based on which we categorize different types of variables. So, let us discuss about the different type of what are the different type of variables. So, firstly I think you all have written that particular diagram. So, I am now erasing it out. So, the first base which we are talking about is the causal relationship. What is causal relationship? Causal relationship means the cause and effect relation which is connected by the organism. That means we are creating a cause that acts upon the organism, and after that, that cause create some sort of behavioral changes within the organism which we seen on the effect or seen as the effect. That is the causal relationship. Just give me, I am saying a very short example. Suppose you want to study the muscular readiness of your subject on the reaction time, as it is part of your semester 1 practical. You all know about that muscular readiness, to determine the effect of muscular readiness on the reaction time of your subject. So, what is the cause here? The cause is the muscular readiness. And muscular readiness is the cause which we try to enumerate or which we try to incorporate within the organism, and after that changes in muscular readiness, the effect of muscular readiness we seen on the effect which is on the reaction time of your subject. So, that is the causal relationship. When we are discussing about the causal relationship, we must need to understand that that particular causal relationship or that particular diagram is mainly we seen in the experimental research. Mostly, I am not saying in every case we see the causal relationship in experimental research only, but it need to be understand that mostly the causal relationship or the cause and effect relationship we found in the experimental research. And the experimental research has 3 important parameters without which we cannot say any research experimental research. The first one is randomization, the second one is replication, and the third one is control. So, a research is considered as the experimental research when it follows these 3 criteria. That means randomization, which say that we have access of the population, we know all the population, and after that we are randomly selected some individual as a sample in our research. Randomization only possible when we have the finite sample size. If the sample size finite population, sorry, if the population is infinite by nature, we doesn't know how many individuals are there, then we cannot do the randomization part. Replication and control, mostly in quasi experimental research as well as in non experimental research we able to follow the replication and control, but the uniqueness of the experimental research lies into the domain of randomization. Without randomization we are not able to do experimental research. So, mostly the cause and effect relationship is indicating the experimental research. So, now let us understand what are the different types of variables operates in the causal relationship. The first variable we are talking about is independent variable. As we say it is a cause and effect relationship, we also considered it as the causal variable. We also say that independent variable is the causal variable. That means which variable or stimulus variable also. Causal variable, stimulus variable, independent variables, all these things are same. Independent variable or stimulus variable is what? That is the domain or the factor which bring changes within the organism, that is known as the independent variables. A construct or any sort of manipulation or any sort of changes that brings some changes within the organism is known as the independent variable. Further, we classify, suppose let see an example. Suppose considered the method of teaching, impact of method of teaching on the academic performance. So, here the method of teaching is known as the independent variable. We can manipulate it. What are the types of manipulation we able to do? Suppose we are selecting three types of method of teaching: lecture method, demonstration method and audiovisual methods. We putting 10 individual or 10 students in each method, and after the teaching we measure their academic performance, and after that academic performance came, we analyze it and we say that particular, suppose audiovisual method is very good method for the method of teaching in case of teaching the students. So, that is the independent variables we are talking about. Now, what are the different types of independent variables are there? There are mainly two bases are there, based on which we can classify the independent variable. So, we can further classify the independent variables into the first base or first parameter based on which we are able to differentiate the independent variable is the mode of manipulation, and the second one is the nature of independent variable. Based on the mode of manipulation, we can classify independent variable into two types. One is type E independent variables and another is type S independent variables. Okay? And based on the nature of variables, we classify independent variables into task variable, subject variables and situation variables. We all know about the manipulation. As we do the experiment in our first semester, we all know how to manipulate, or what we know, mostly we know about what is manipulation. So, I am not getting into the point of manipulation, I am just saying based on the manipulation we are able to classify the independent variables into two categories. The first one is type E independent variable, which reflects, that means when we able to manipulate or change the independent variable. As a researcher, I have the authority or I have the autonomy to change the independent variable or manipulate the independent variable, that is known as the type E variable. In case of type S variable, as a researcher we are not able to change the or manipulate the independent variable, rather we focusing on the selection to create the manipulation. Suppose you want to study the effect of age on reaction time, so you cannot change or manipulate the age of a particular person, you are able to select persons of different age groups. So, that is the type S variable. Now, what is the nature of nature of independent variables? Further classify into three categories. The first one is task variable. That means when we are providing the subject with a behavioral task and they perform the task. Suppose effect of number of stimulus on the reaction type of your subject. So, in first case you are giving him a single stimulus and recorded his reaction time. After that you give him 2 stimulus and recorded his reaction time. After that you give him 3 stimulus and recorded that reaction time. That means subject have to perform a task, that means it is known as the task related independent variables. The second one is situation related or environmental independent variables. That means when we study the environmental factor, suppose you want to study the effect of shift work on the production of a particular factory. Suppose you are going to a organization or in a suppose you are going to Wipro. So, they have two shifts, day shift and night shift, and you try to understand how they perform in the day shift and how they perform in the night shift. That means you are not creating any sort of changes within the subject, you are just creating a situation, or you are just take the situation day work and night work, and you want to study that particular factor, that is known as the environment relevant independent variable. And the last one is subject relevant. That means we are just selecting subjects and want to study their characteristics. We are not able to manipulate them. Suppose the first example I am saying that age is the independent, when age is the independent variable, we are not able to create changes in the age of a person. So, we are selecting different age groups. Okay. So, that is the subject relevant independent variable are there. Subject relevant independent variable might be natural. Suppose you want to study the age factor, and it might be induced also. How you can change induced subject relevant variable through the induction? Suppose you provide different type of instruction to the subject, and after that you want to study his reaction time. That means you are induced some sort of changes, some sort of behavioral changes within the subject to understand his outcome. So, the independent variable part is over. Now, we shift on the dependent variable. Dependent variable is very easy to understand, the outcome, nothing more than that. Whatever changes we make in independent variable, it affects on something, and that particular outcome is known as the dependent variable. Dependent variable does not have any sort of classification, it only has two effects. The first one is floor effect and the second one is ceiling effect. If any task or the independent variable is very much easy by nature, then the floor effect comes. That means if a task is very much difficult, then the floor effect comes. That means every subject performed and their result is on the lower side, and when the task difficulty is lesser, then every subject performance is on the higher side, that is the floor effect and ceiling effect, and independent variable just like that. Now, we shift on the extraneous variable or EV. There are mainly three types of EVs are there. One is subject relevant, another is situation relevant, and the last one is sequence relevant. Subject relevant extraneous variables refers to those particular variables which the researcher don't want to study, but it has within the organism. So, it creates some sort of impact in the cause and effect relationship. Suppose you want to study the age factor, but you does not want to study the gender factor, but gender is a constant factor within the subject. So, it creates some sort of changes within the response of the subject, and it is considered as the subject relevant independent extraneous variable. Now, we shift over on the situation relevant. As we do our research on the human beings and as we do our research on the real life situation. So, as we do the research on the human subjects, so it is always situational factors are there which might create some sort of changes in the within the subject, and we are able to predict it and we try to control it, but we cannot eliminate them properly, or we cannot say that we eliminate all the situation relevant extraneous variable. Situation relevant extraneous variables, that means some extraneous variables which are in the situation or in the reality where we collect our data, and we try to control it as much as possible, but we cannot eliminate all the situation relevant independent variable extraneous variable. And the last one is sequence relevant extraneous variable. Sequence relevant extraneous variable, suppose you are giving subject, you are taking data from your subject and you are providing stimulus in a specific order. When you are providing the stimulus in a specific order, it created some sort of sequence, and it is known as the sequence relevant extraneous variable, which further created some effect. I am not written it. One is practice effect, another is fatigue effect, another is anticipation error, and another is habituation error. Okay. So, those are the 3 extraneous variables are there, and the last one is intervening and confounding variable, and it is very interesting thing, that is some variables are always there which the researcher is not able to find out, or which the researcher does not have the knowledge. In case of extraneous variable, what is the difference between extraneous variable and intervening variable? In case of extraneous variable, the researcher knows that those variables are there, but in case of intervening variable, as a researcher we are not able to identify if that variable operates within the organism or not. Suppose you want to study the job satisfaction of a subject. So, when you study the job satisfaction of a subject, job satisfaction is closely related with the work motivation, and you do not know if the subject is motivated towards his work or not. So, here the work motivation act as an intervening variable. You are not able to find it, you are not able to eliminate it, or you are not able to control it. So, that is the intervening or confounding variable we are talking about. The second domain, which we say the study design. So, in the previous part when we are discussing about the causal relationship, I firstly said that in experimental research the basic pillars are randomization, replication and control. In case of study design, the study design always lack of any one or any two of that particular parameters. That means either the study design have replication and control without the randomization, or it does not have two parameters. Okay. When the research is not follow those 3 basic parameters of experimental research, that particular research is considered as a study. Okay. When a research is a study, based on the study design, we can classify the variables into 2 parts. One is active variable and another is attribute variable. So, what is active variable? The variable which can be manipulated or changed. Just simply independent variable in experimental research and active variable in study design is completely more or less, we say more or less those 2 factors are same. Okay. What we say independent variable in experimental research, we say the same thing in case of study design, but we term this as active variable. And another thing is attribute variable. What are the attribute variables? The effect of change which we did in the active variable, it is measured into the attribute variable, and the attribute variable is something which we want to control. That means what we studied in the experimental research or in causal relationship as dependent variable and extraneous variable, that is known as the attribute variable in case of study design. Okay. Now, change our focus onto the unit of measurement, and based on the unit of measurement, we further classify the variables into 2 different categories. One is qualitative variable and another is quantitative variable. What is qualitative variables? when we and measure a particular domain or a particular variable or a particular characteristics without assigning any numerical value or magnitude. Suppose you are measuring the trauma of a person. When you measuring the trauma of a person, you are taking his or her interview, and it is a discourse. It is not a particular value. You are not providing that, okay, you say something, okay, I will give you 1 point. So, in that particular case, you are taken the data in form of discourse without any numerical value, without any magnitude, and that particular variable category is known as the qualitative variable. Next one, the quantitative variable. Quantitative variable is something which is completely opposite of the qualitative variable. In quantitative variables, we always measure a particular domain or characteristics through some numerical values and magnitudes. Without the numerical values and magnitudes, we are not able to quantify many of the variables or many of the domains. So, it is very important for psychology to establish the discipline as a scientific disciplines when we able to quantify the different domains of psychology, we able to establish the subject or discipline as a scientific discipline. So, quantification of the different domains or characteristics is very much important. That is why we came into the quantification part, and quantitative variables is something when we providing a numerical value or magnitude to a particular domain, it is known as the quantitative variable. Further, we classify the quantitative variables into 2 categories. First one is the categorical variable. Categorical variable refers to the when we have categorized the variable into 2 or 3 categories. We are not able to continuously measure it. We are not able to continuously measure that particular variable. We must have to categorize or discrete the variables, that is known as the categorical or discrete variables. The first categorical part of the categorical variable is known as the constant. That means which is a constant factor. Suppose human species is a constant. Water level, suppose water quantity in our whole world, it is a constant variable. We cannot manipulate it, we cannot categorize it, it is completely constant thing, and we have to just get into the fact that is a constant. The second one is that is the dichotomous variable. What is dichotomous variable? When we have categorized the variable only 2 categories, that is known as the dichotomous variable. Suppose if we are taken data from the HIV patient, there are only 2 categories are there. You are taking control data from the persons who does not have infected by the HIV, that means HIV negative population, and you also taken data who already have the infection of HIV, that means HIV positive population. So, HIV is something, or HIV is a variable which is a dichotomous variable, either you are HIV positive or you are HIV negative, you cannot stand in between them. So, it is those variables are mainly called as dichotomous variable, and last one is the polytomous variable. When we have more than 2 categories, suppose age, more than 2 categories, gender, male, female, transgender. So, there are 3 or 4 or 5 categories are there, and we call those categorical variables as a polytomous categorical variables. And further we classify the polytomous categorical variables into 2 parts, one is nominal and another is ordinal. Nominal means when we are just able to categorize it, nothing more than that. You get the data from some persons and you just categorized it at male, female and transgender, nothing more than that. When we are saying that ordinal variable, in case of ordinal variable, we are not only categorize the variable, but we are able to rank the variable based on some sort of magnitude. That means when we able to magnitude the variable and when we able to rank it, it is known as the ordinal variable. And the last category which we are last types of variables are continuous variables. As we say, when we able to continuously measure a variable over the period of time at any moment, at any population, at any culture, at any time, when we able to measure a variable in a continuous process and it also have the measurement category into fractions. It is a very important case of control variable. Continuous variable also came into fraction. So, those are the variables known as the continuous variable. Further, we classify the continuous variable into two parts, interval variable and ratio variable. Interval variable possesses the properties of nominal and ordinal, as well as it has the quality of normality. That means, we able to categorize the interval variable, or we able to create a interval within the data set of our subject. Okay, that is the interval variable. And the ratio variable, it mostly used in the basic science. In psychology, no variables are fallen in the paradigm of ratio scale. It is considered as the ratio scale is the scale which has the absolute 0 in it. It has the all properties of nominal, ordinal and interval variable as well as the absolute 0. In psychology, no variable is or no variable has the absolute 0. So, the ratio scale is not our matter of concern, or we are not study the ratio scale actually. Okay. So, let end our discussion today here. Okay.